Ten Mother Bear saved Baby from tornado by creating underground bunker system. What she built was incredible. The morning mist hung low over the valley like a silver blanket, and Ethan Marshall adjusted his camera lens for what he thought would be another routine day of wildlife photography. He had been camping in these ancient woods for 3 weeks now, documenting the lives of the creatures that called this place home. The forest had a way of speaking to those who listened, and today something felt different. The usual chorus of birds had fallen silent, replaced by a strange, almost imperceptible hum that seemed to rise from the earth itself. It was a sound he couldn't quite place, like the ground was breathing, or perhaps singing a song too low for human ears to properly understand. Ethan had heard stories from the locals about this phenomenon. They called it the forest's song, an ancient warning that came before the great winds. Most dismissed it as folklore, the kind of tales passed down through generations of people who lived too close to nature and let their imaginations run wild. But standing there in the clearing, feeling that vibration travel up through his boots and into his bones, Ethan couldn't dismiss it so easily. The air itself felt electric, charged with an energy that made the hair on his arms stand up. He lowered his camera and simply stood there, listening, watching, waiting for something he couldn't name. That's when he saw her. The mother bear he had been tracking for the past week emerged from the tree line about 50 yards away. She was massive, easily 400 pounds of muscle and fur, with eyes that held an intelligence that always made Ethan pause. Bears were smart, everyone knew that, but this one seemed different somehow. She moved with purpose, not the usual ambling gait of a foraging bear, but with deliberate, measured steps that suggested she had somewhere specific to be. Her cub, barely 6 months old, tumbled along behind her, occasionally stopping to sniff at interesting rocks or chase after floating dandelion seeds. But the mother bear paid no attention to the usual distractions. She walked straight to the base of an enormous redwood tree, one of the ancient giants that had stood in this forest for perhaps 1,000 years. Its trunk was so wide that it would take 8 people holding hands to circle it completely. The bear stopped at its base and began to do something that made Ethan's breath catch in his throat. She started digging, but not in the casual way bears usually dig for grubs or roots. This was methodical, precise. She would dig for a moment, then step back and look at her work, almost as if she was measuring something with her eyes. Ethan raised his camera slowly, not wanting to startle her, and began recording. Through his lens, he could see the concentration on the bear's face, the way her brow furrowed as she worked. She wasn't just digging a hole. She was excavating with purpose, moving dirt and stones in specific directions, creating piles that seemed to have their own organization. Every now and then, she would pick up a particularly large stone, examine it carefully, then either set it aside in what appeared to be a special pile, or carry it to another location entirely. The cub watched its mother work with what could only be described as fascination. It tried to help, pushing small stones with its tiny paws, mimicking its mother's movements in that endearing way young animals do when they're learning. But when it got too close to the main excavation, the mother would gently nudge it away with her massive head, a clear message that this was serious work that required space and concentration. As the hours passed, Ethan remained transfixed. He had photographed bears for years, had seen them fish for salmon, teach their cubs to climb, even witnessed their complex social interactions. But this was something entirely different. The hole the mother bear was creating wasn't random or chaotic. It had structure. She was creating what looked like an entrance, sloped at a specific angle, with the excavated dirt carefully placed to form walls on either side. The large stones she had been collecting were being positioned around the entrance in what almost looked like a deliberate pattern. The hum in the earth grew stronger as the day wore on, and Ethan noticed other changes too. The leaves on the trees had stopped their usual rustling, hanging perfectly still despite what should have been a light afternoon breeze. The temperature had dropped several degrees, and there was a metallic taste in the air that reminded him of the moments before a thunderstorm, though the sky above remained clear and blue. Even the light seemed different, taking on a quality that made everything appear sharper, more defined, as if the world had suddenly come into perfect focus. The mother bear worked tirelessly, her powerful claws moving earth with an efficiency that would make any construction crew envious. By late afternoon, she had created not just a hole, but what was clearly becoming an entrance to something much larger. She disappeared inside for long stretches, and Ethan could hear the muffled sounds of continued digging from within. When she emerged, she would often carry mouthfuls of dirt or push out larger rocks with her powerful shoulders. Each time she came out, she would pause, look at the sky, sniff the air, then return to her work with renewed urgency. The cub had long since given up trying to help directly and had taken to playing nearby, but always within sight of the entrance where its mother worked. It seemed to understand on some instinctual level that something important was happening, that this wasn't the time for wandering off or demanding attention. Every so often, as the mother would emerge and nuzzle her cub briefly, a reassurance that everything was all right, before returning to her task. As the sun began to set, painting the forest in shades of gold and amber, Ethan realized he had been watching for nearly 8 hours. His legs were stiff from standing in roughly the same position, his camera battery was running low, but he couldn't bring himself to leave. What he was witnessing felt momentous, like being present for something that humans weren't usually privileged to see. The bear's construction project had evolved considerably throughout the day. What had started as a simple hole was now clearly an entrance to an underground structure of some complexity. The mother bear emerged one final time as darkness began to fall, and this time she didn't return to digging. Instead, she sat beside the entrance and pulled her cub close, grooming it with long, careful strokes of her tongue. The cub settled against her massive form, and they sat there together, silhouetted against the fading light, looking for all the world like any mother and child taking comfort in each other's presence. But there was something else in the bear's posture, a watchfulness, an anticipation that suggested she was waiting for something. Ethan finally lowered his camera and made his way back to his camp, his mind racing with questions. What had he just witnessed? Bears didn't build structures like this. They might dig simple dens for hibernation, but this was something else entirely. The precision, the planning, the obvious intelligence behind the construction was unlike anything in any wildlife behavior study he had ever read. And that hum in the earth, growing stronger by the hour, what did it mean? The locals' stories about the forest's song suddenly seemed less like folklore and more like ancestral knowledge passed down through generations who had learned to read the subtle signs of their environment. That night, Ethan barely slept. He lay in his tent, listening to the forest, and noticed that the usual nocturnal sounds were absent. No owls hooting, no rustling of small mammals in the underbrush, no chirping of crickets. Just that low, constant hum that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Several times he got up and walked to the edge of his camp, looking toward where he knew the bear's construction site was, though he couldn't see it in the darkness. The air felt heavy, pregnant with possibility, like the moment before a symphony begins when the conductor raises their baton and everyone holds their breath. The next morning came earlier than usual, or perhaps it just seemed that way because Ethan had been awake, waiting for first light. He quickly broke his fast with some trail mix and instant coffee, then made his way back to the redwood tree. The mother bear was already at work, and what Ethan saw made him stop in his tracks. Overnight, the entrance had been reinforced with stones, creating what looked like a proper doorway. But more incredibly, he could see that the bear had been working on the interior, and from what he could glimpse when she emerged, she had created what appeared to be a tunnel system. She would disappear for 20 or 30 minutes at a time now, and the sounds that emerged suggested she was working deeper underground. When she came out, she was often covered in a different type of soil, darker and damper, suggesting she had reached a lower level. The cub now stayed well back from the entrance, playing with pine cones and occasionally looking toward where its mother worked with what seemed like patient understanding. By midday, something else had changed. Other animals had begun to appear at the edges of the clearing. A family of deer stood perfectly still among the trees, watching. Several rabbits sat in the grass, their usual skittishness replaced by an odd calm. Even a fox had emerged from somewhere and sat observing the bear's work with what could only be described as interest. None of these animals showed any fear of each other or of Ethan. They all seemed to be waiting, watching, as if they too understood that something significant was happening. The mother bear's work had taken on an even more frantic pace. She was no longer just digging, but seemed to be shaping and sculpting the interior space. Occasionally, she would drag in branches and what looked like dried grass, materials that seemed oddly specific for a bear's den. The way she arranged them suggested not random nest building but deliberate construction with a purpose Ethan couldn't quite grasp. Every action seemed calculated, every movement part of a larger plan that existed fully formed in the bear's mind. As the afternoon wore on, the hum in the earth had become impossible to ignore. It was no longer just a vibration, but almost a sound, a deep bass note that seemed to resonate in Ethan's chest. The air had taken on a green-gold quality, like looking at the world through an old glass bottle. The leaves on the trees had begun to turn their pale undersides up, a sign Ethan recognized as preceding severe weather, though the sky remained cloudless. But it wasn't just the sky directly above that was clear. It was the quality of the clearness that was unusual, an almost crystalline transparency that made the blue seem deeper than normal. The mother bear emerged from the tunnel and stood on her hind legs, her massive frame stretching up as she sniffed the air. Her nose worked frantically, processing information that her ancient instincts could interpret in ways human science was only beginning to understand. She dropped back to all fours and made a sound, not quite a growl, not quite a call, but something in between. Her cub immediately stopped playing and ran to her side. She nuzzled it once, then guided it toward the entrance of the structure she had been building. But the cub hesitated at the entrance, perhaps frightened by the darkness within. The mother bear didn't force it. Instead, she went in first, and Ethan could hear her moving around inside, making soft, encouraging sounds. After a moment, the cub followed, disappearing into the darkness. They stayed inside for several minutes, and when they emerged, the cub seemed less frightened, more curious about this new space its mother had created. They went in and out several more times, the mother clearly teaching her young one that this was a safe place, a refuge. As the sun began to set on the second day of observation, Ethan noticed that the forest had become completely silent. Even the hum had stopped, replaced by a stillness so complete it felt like the world was holding its breath. The mother bear made one final inspection of her construction, checking the entrance, moving a few more stones into position. Then she sat beside it with her cub, grooming it as she had the night before. But this time there was no relaxation in her posture. She was alert, ready, waiting. Ethan realized his hands were shaking slightly as he adjusted his camera settings for low light. Whatever was coming, whatever the bear had been preparing for, he had the feeling it would happen soon. The stories the locals told about the forest's song, about the great winds that came once in a generation, suddenly seemed very real. And this bear, this magnificent creature who had spent 2 days building something that shouldn't exist, according to everything humans thought they knew about animal behavior, she knew it was coming too. The last light faded from the sky, but it wasn't replaced by normal darkness. Instead, the air itself seemed to glow faintly, a phosphorescent quality that made everything visible in soft, ethereal detail. The mother bear stood, nudged her cub, and they both looked toward the entrance of the underground structure. Then she turned and looked directly at Ethan, and in that moment he could have sworn he saw recognition in her eyes. An acknowledgement that he had been watching, that he was witnessing something important. Then she guided her cub into the entrance and followed, but not before grabbing a large, flat stone she had set aside and pulling it with her. From his position, Ethan watched in amazement as the bear maneuvered the stone from inside, fitting it perfectly into the entrance like a door. It wasn't a complete seal, there were gaps around the edges for air, but it was clearly meant as a barrier. The engineering required to create an entrance that could be sealed from the inside, the foresight to select and position the right stone. It all spoke to a level of intelligence and planning that would revolutionize understanding of animal cognition if he could properly document it. The forest remained in that eerie, glowing stillness for several more hours. Ethan stayed at his position, camera ready, every sense alert. Around midnight, the change began. At first, it was just a whisper of wind in the highest branches of the trees, so faint it could have been imagination. Then the glow in the air began to pulse, slowly at first, then faster, like a heartbeat accelerating. The hum returned, but different now, not coming from the earth but from the air itself, a resonance that made the leaves tremble without any apparent wind. Then Ethan saw it. In the distance, perhaps a mile away, a column of air became visible, not because of any debris it carried, but because it was distorting the glowing quality of the atmosphere, creating a spiral of light that reached from the forest floor up into the darkness above. It was beautiful and terrifying in equal measure, a pillar of pure energy moving through the forest with a grace that seemed almost deliberate. It wasn't the chaotic, destructive tornado that Ethan had expected from the bear's preparations. This was something else, something that seemed almost alive. The spiral moved closer, and Ethan could see that it wasn't destroying everything in its path. Instead, it was moving between the trees, bending them, but not breaking them, lifting leaves and debris in a perfect spiral that seemed to follow some incomprehensible pattern. When it passed over a small pond, the water rose in a perfect helix, suspended in the air for a moment before falling back like rain. It was as if the wind was dancing with the forest rather than attacking it. As it approached the ancient redwood where the bear had built her shelter, Ethan felt his heart racing. The massive tree groaned and swayed, its ancient branches creating a symphony of creaks and whispers. The wind investigated the base of the tree, swirling around it, and for a moment it seemed to pause directly over where the bear's entrance was hidden. Leaves and small branches were lifted and spun in the air, creating a vortex of forest debris, but the flat stone covering the entrance remained unmoved, the construction holding firm against the incredible forces at play. The wind lingered there for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, then continued on its path through the forest. Ethan watched it disappear into the distance, that column of spiraling light gradually fading until the forest returned to its previous glowing stillness. He waited, hardly daring to breathe, watching the covered entrance. After about an hour, he saw movement. The stone shifted slightly, then was pushed aside from within. The mother bear's head emerged, cautiously sniffing the air. Determining it was safe, she emerged fully, followed by her cub, who seemed entirely unafraid, even curious about the changed landscape around them. The forest floor was carpeted with a perfect spiral pattern of leaves and twigs, as if a giant hand had drawn circles in the debris. Some trees had been bent into graceful arcs, their branches now reaching in new directions. But nothing was destroyed, nothing was broken. It was as if the forest had been rearranged rather than damaged, transformed rather than devastated. The mother bear surveyed the scene with what looked like satisfaction, then began to investigate the patterns left behind, her cub following and mimicking her actions. As dawn broke, the glowing quality of the air faded, replaced by normal morning light. But the forest had changed. Ethan could see it in the way the light filtered through the repositioned branches, in the new patterns on the forest floor, in the way certain trees now leaned toward each other as if in conversation. The mother bear was already at work again, but this time she was opening up the entrance to her shelter, removing the stone door and clearing away any debris that had accumulated. She went inside several times, and when she emerged, she seemed satisfied that everything within had remained intact. The cub played in the spiral patterns left by the wind, jumping from one swirl to another, as if they were a game designed specifically for young bears. Its mother watched with what could only be described as maternal pride, occasionally joining in the play, batting at floating leaves that still danced in the now gentle morning breeze. The terror and anticipation of the night seemed forgotten, replaced by a sense of renewal, of having passed through something significant, and emerged safely on the other side. Other animals began to return to the area, and Ethan noticed they too seemed different. They moved through the spiral patterns with purpose, some following the lines, others crossing them at specific points. Birds began to sing again, but their song seemed to incorporate new notes, as if they were describing what they had witnessed. The deer that had watched the bear's construction returned and actually approached the entrance to the underground shelter, sniffing at it with obvious interest before moving on. Even the fox returned, sitting at a respectful distance but clearly observing the bear family with continued fascination. Ethan realized he had been documenting something far more complex than just animal behavior. The bear hadn't just known the wind was coming, she had prepared for it in a way that suggested deep, perhaps generational knowledge. The structure she had built wasn't just a shelter, it was a carefully engineered survival system designed to withstand a specific type of natural phenomenon. And the wind itself wasn't the destructive force he had expected, but something that seemed to be part of the forest's natural cycle, a reshaping rather than a destruction. As he reviewed the footage he had captured, Ethan's hands trembled with the magnitude of what he had witnessed. The scientific community would struggle to accept this. It challenged so many assumptions about animal intelligence, about the relationship between creatures and their environment, about the very nature of what humans classified as instinct versus reasoning. But he had the proof. Hours of footage showing the bear's methodical construction, the gathering of the animals, the strange spiral wind, and the aftermath. The mother bear spent the rest of the morning doing something else remarkable. She began to modify her shelter, adding to it, expanding certain areas, reinforcing others. It was as if the wind had been a test, and now that her design had proven successful, she was improving upon it. She brought in new materials, different types of stones, even what looked like clay from a nearby stream bank. The cub helped more actively now, seeming to understand better what its mother was doing, learning not just through observation but through participation. By noon, park ranger Lily Morgan had arrived, having been contacted by Ethan the previous evening when he realized something extraordinary was happening. She was skeptical at first. The story sounded too fantastical. But when she saw the spiral patterns on the forest floor, the precisely engineered entrance to the bear's shelter, and most importantly, Ethan's footage, her skepticism turned to awe. Together, they documented the site more thoroughly, taking measurements, soil samples, and photographs from every angle. Lily had been a ranger in these woods for 15 years, and she had heard the old-timers talk about the forest's song and the great winds. But like most people with scientific training, she had dismissed them as folklore, stories that had grown in the telling until they bore little resemblance to whatever natural phenomenon had originally inspired them. Now, faced with evidence that suggested those stories were more accurate than anyone had imagined, she had to reconsider everything she thought she knew about the forest and its inhabitants. The mother bear tolerated their presence with surprising patience, perhaps recognizing them as non-threats or possibly understanding on some level that they were witnesses to her accomplishment. She continued her work, now focusing on what appeared to be ventilation shafts, small tunnels that led from the main chamber to the surface at different points. The engineering was sophisticated, each shaft angled to prevent rain from entering while still allowing airflow. It was the kind of design that human engineers would create, but here it was, being built by a bear with nothing but her claws and innate understanding. As they documented the shelter, Ethan and Lily began to understand its true complexity. It wasn't a single chamber but a series of interconnected spaces, each serving a different purpose. There was what appeared to be a main living area, smaller side chambers that could serve as storage or separate sleeping areas, and most remarkably, what looked like a drainage system that would channel any water that did enter away from the main spaces. The bear had essentially created an underground home that could withstand not just wind, but potentially flooding as well. The cub had grown comfortable with their presence and would occasionally approach them, though its mother would always call it back before it got too close. It was clear that while she tolerated the humans, she was still teaching her cub appropriate wariness. This, too, was remarkable, the ability to distinguish between immediate threat and benign observation, to allow for exceptional circumstances while still maintaining important survival lessons. As the afternoon progressed, more animals appeared, and Ethan began to notice a pattern. They weren't just randomly returning to the area, they were investigating the bear's shelter. Each species seemed to spend time near the entrance, observing, learning. A family of raccoons actually ventured briefly inside while the bears were away foraging, emerging quickly but with what looked like thoughtful expressions. Several squirrels began collecting materials and taking them to the base of another large tree, as if inspired to begin their own construction projects. The implications were staggering. If the bear's knowledge of the coming wind was instinctual, how was that instinct so specific, so architectural? And if it was learned behavior, passed down from mother to cub, it suggested a level of cultural transmission in bears that had never been documented. Even more intriguing was the apparent interest and understanding shown by other species. Was it possible that the forest community had ways of sharing information that humans had never recognized? As evening approached on this second day of documentation, Lily set up motion-activated cameras around the site to capture any nocturnal activity. She and Ethan established a proper observation blind at a respectful distance, equipped with night vision equipment and recording devices. They were determined to document everything, to capture whatever else might unfold in this remarkable location. The mother bear seemed to accept these new additions to her environment, perhaps understanding that the humans meant no harm and were simply trying to understand what she already knew. The sunset painted the forest in warm hues, and the spiral patterns on the ground seemed to glow in the golden light. The mother bear had finished her modifications for the day and was now foraging with her cub, teaching it which plants had been exposed by the wind's rearrangement of the forest floor. They moved through the spirals with purpose, finding newly uncovered roots and grubs in places where the wind had shifted the earth. It was as if the wind, far from being purely destructive, had actually refreshed the forest floor, creating new foraging opportunities. That night, as Ethan and Lily kept watch from their blind, they observed something else remarkable. Other bears began to arrive, approaching the shelter with what could only be described as respect. The mother bear emerged and interacted with them, and though bears were typically solitary creatures, there was clear communication happening. The visitors inspected the shelter, some even entering briefly, always with the mother bear's permission. It was as if she was teaching them, sharing her knowledge of construction and survival. One elderly female bear spent particularly long examining the structure, running her paws along the reinforced entrance, investigating the ventilation shafts, even lying down in the main chamber as if testing its comfort. When she emerged, she touched noses with the mother bear, a gesture that seemed to convey approval or perhaps gratitude. Then she ambled off into the forest, but not before pausing to look back at the shelter one more time, as if committing its design to memory. The cub watched all these interactions with intense interest, learning not just about shelter construction but about social dynamics, about the sharing of knowledge, about community in a species that was supposed to be largely solitary. Every visitor seemed to teach the cub something new, whether it was a different way to move a stone or a particular call that conveyed specific information. The education happening here was multi-layered and complex, far beyond simple mimicry or instinct. As the night deepened, the forest settled into more normal patterns, though the spiral designs on the ground continued to be navigated by various nocturnal creatures, as if they were paths or perhaps messages written in a language humans couldn't read. Owls had returned and were calling from the bent trees, their hoots seeming to echo differently off the newly arranged branches. Even the insects had returned, but their movements followed the spiral patterns, creating a choreography of tiny lights as fireflies emerged and danced along the wind-drawn lines. The mother bear made one final check of her shelter before settling for the night, not inside it, but near the entrance where she could guard it while still remaining alert to any changes in the forest. Her cub curled up against her massive form, safe and warm, occasionally stirring to nurse before falling back into peaceful sleep. The scene was tranquil, domestic even, but Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that he was witnessing something profound about the nature of intelligence and survival in the wild. As the hours passed, Ethan and Lily took turns watching and resting, maintaining their vigil over this remarkable sight. They spoke in whispers about what they had seen, trying to make sense of it within their scientific framework, while acknowledging that much of what they had witnessed challenged that very framework. The bear's construction wasn't just functional, it was elegant, demonstrating not just problem-solving but aesthetic consideration, forward planning, and complex engineering skills. Near dawn, something unexpected happened. A young male bear arrived, clearly injured, limping badly, with what looked like a deep gash on his hind leg. The mother bear rose immediately, sniffing at the injured bear, then did something extraordinary. She guided him into her shelter, into one of the side chambers they had identified earlier. She brought him moss and leaves, creating a bed, then left and returned with something in her mouth that looked like specific plants. She placed these near the injured bear, who began to chew them slowly. The medicinal use of plants by bears wasn't entirely unknown to science, but the deliberate selection, the specific preparation, and most remarkably, the use of the shelter as a healing space, was unprecedented. The mother bear had created not just a storm shelter but a multi-purpose refuge that could serve various needs of the forest community. Her cub watched everything, learning lessons about compassion and healing, along with construction and survival. As the sun rose on the third day, Ethan and Lily knew they had documented something that would change how humans understood animal intelligence and behavior. But more than that, they had witnessed something that suggested the natural world operated on levels of complexity and communication that science had barely begun to explore. The mother bear's shelter stood as testament to this hidden knowledge, a structure that bridged the gap between instinct and architecture, between individual survival and community wisdom. The forest had returned to what seemed like normal activity, but Ethan could see that nothing was really the same. The spiral patterns remained on the ground, slowly being incorporated into the regular paths of animals. The bent trees created new highways for squirrels and birds. The bear's shelter had become a landmark, a point of reference that other animals oriented themselves around. And the mother bear continued to refine and improve her construction, each day adding small modifications that suggested she was preparing not just for one wind, but for a lifetime of challenges. The morning of the fourth day brought with it a change that Ethan felt in his bones before he saw it with his eyes. The air had taken on that strange violet hue again, but this time it was deeper, richer, like looking at the world through amethyst glass. The mother bear emerged from her shelter where she had been tending to the injured young male and stood perfectly still, her nose raised to the sky, reading signs that humans had forgotten how to interpret. Her cub stayed close to her side, mimicking her posture, learning to read the subtle language of the atmosphere that would one day save its own life. Lily had been reviewing the footage from the night cameras and discovered something remarkable. Throughout the night, animals had been visiting the shelter in a steady stream, but they weren't just investigating anymore. They were bringing things. A crow had dropped several shiny objects near the entrance, including what looked like pieces of quartz that caught the morning light. A family of rabbits had left a pile of specific herbs, different from the ones the mother bear had gathered for the injured bear. Even a deer had contributed, leaving behind shed antler velvet that was prized in the forest for its medicinal properties. It was as if the forest community was contributing to what the bear had built, acknowledging its value and adding their own knowledge to the collection. The injured young bear emerged from the shelter, his limp noticeably improved. The plants the mother bear had given him seemed to have had a remarkable effect, reducing swelling and clearly easing his pain. He touched noses with her in what appeared to be gratitude, then looked at the shelter with something approaching reverence. Before leaving, he did something unexpected. He picked up a particularly large stone that had been lying nearby and placed it carefully near the entrance, adding to the mother bear's construction. It was a small gesture, but it spoke volumes about the understanding that had developed around this place. As the violet hue in the air intensified, Ethan noticed that the hum had returned, but it was different from before. This wasn't the deep earth song that had preceded the first wind. This was higher, almost melodic, like the forest itself was harmonizing with something approaching from a great distance. The mother bear began to move with renewed purpose, but this time she wasn't adding to her shelter. Instead, she was clearing the spiral patterns on the ground, removing leaves and debris that had accumulated over the past days, as if preparing a stage for something important. Her cub helped, its small paws working diligently to clear the spirals, and soon other animals joined in. Squirrels carried away twigs, birds picked up smaller debris, even insects seemed to be organizing themselves along the cleared lines. It was a communal effort that defied everything Ethan thought he knew about interspecies cooperation. These weren't symbiotic relationships or mutual benefit arrangements that could be easily explained by evolutionary biology. This was something else, a conscious collaboration toward a purpose that seemed to transcend individual survival. By midday, the spirals on the forest floor were clearly visible again, and they seemed to be glowing faintly in the violet light. The mother bear positioned herself at the center of the largest spiral, her cub beside her, and they waited. Other animals began to arrange themselves along the spiral lines, creating a living pattern that expanded outward from the bears at the center. Ethan's hand shook as he documented this, knowing that no one would believe it without the video evidence. The organization, the deliberate positioning, it suggested a level of communication and shared purpose that challenged the very foundations of animal behavioral science. Then the wind came, but this time it wasn't a single column of spiraling air. It was multiple smaller vortexes, each one following the cleared spiral patterns on the ground with impossible precision. They danced through the forest like living things, interweaving with each other, creating complex patterns in the air that mirrored the designs on the ground. The animals stood their ground, not fleeing, but participating, their bodies serving as anchor points that seemed to guide the wind's movement. The mother bear stood perfectly still as one of the vortexes passed directly over her, lifting her fur, swirling around her massive form, but she didn't move. Her cub pressed against her side, frightened but trusting, learning that sometimes the right response to nature's power wasn't to run or hide, but to stand firm and become part of it. The wind investigated them, seemed to recognize them, then moved on, following the spiral path toward the next participant in this extraordinary dance. Each animal received the wind's attention in turn, and as it touched them, something changed. Ethan couldn't explain it scientifically, but he could see it clearly through his camera lens. The animals seemed to shimmer, as if the wind was leaving something behind, some kind of energy or information that was being absorbed into their bodies. The crow's feathers took on an iridescent quality that hadn't been there before. The rabbit's fur seemed to ripple with patterns that resembled the spirals on the ground. Even the trees that lined the spirals began to show changes, their bark developing new patterns that looked like natural artwork. The dance of the winds continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 minutes. They swirled and intertwined, creating aerial sculptures of incredible beauty, lifting seeds and pollen in patterns that would ensure the forest's diversity for generations to come. The mother bear's shelter served as a kind of anchor point for the entire display, with the winds returning to it repeatedly, as if it was a hub from which all the patterns emanated. The structure she had built wasn't just a shelter from the wind, it was part of the wind's design, integrated into the forest's larger system in ways that human science had never imagined possible. When the winds finally began to dissipate, they didn't just disappear. They seemed to sink into the ground, following the root systems of the great trees, leaving behind a trail of that same phosphorescent glow that had preceded their arrival. The violet hue in the air faded slowly, replaced by a golden light that made everything in the forest seem more alive, more vibrant than before. The animals began to move again, but their movements were different, more coordinated, as if they were now all part of some larger organism that moved with shared purpose. The mother bear walked slowly around the spirals, inspecting them, and Ethan could see that they had changed. Where before they had been simple patterns in the debris, now they seemed to be etched into the earth itself, permanent markers that would remain long after the leaves and twigs were gone. She paused at various points, sniffing, touching the ground with her paw, as if reading information that had been left behind. Her cub followed, learning to interpret these signs, adding another layer to its education in forest wisdom. That evening, As the sun set through the trees that had been touched by the wind, the light created patterns Ethan had never seen before. The rearranged branches and the new growth patterns on the bark combined to cast shadows that looked like writing, like messages in a language older than human civilization. The mother bear settled near her shelter, grooming her cub, but her eyes remained watchful, as if she knew that what had happened today was just one part of a larger cycle that was still unfolding. Lily had been taking detailed measurements throughout the day, and her findings were remarkable. The soil composition had changed in the areas where the winds had touched down, showing increased mineral content and biological activity. The electromagnetic readings were off the charts, suggesting that some kind of energy transfer had taken place. But, most remarkably, the plants in the affected areas were already showing new growth. Shoots and buds appearing weeks ahead of their normal schedule, as if the wind had accelerated time itself in certain pockets of the forest. As darkness fell, the phosphorescent glow that had sunk into the ground began to emerge again, but this time it wasn't random. It followed specific paths, connecting the spiral patterns to the bear's shelter, to certain trees, to underground water sources. It was mapping the forest's hidden architecture, revealing connections that had always been there, but had never been visible to human eyes. The mother bear watched this with what looked like satisfaction, as if seeing confirmation that her work, her shelter, had been accepted into this larger system. The injured young bear returned that night, walking without any limp now, fully healed. He approached the mother bear and her cub with what could only be described as reverence, touching noses with both of them before settling nearby. Other bears began to arrive as well, and Ethan counted at least 6 adults, all examining the glowing patterns on the ground, all showing the same recognition and understanding. They communicated in low rumbles and subtle body language, sharing information about what they had experienced, what they had learned. One of the arriving bears, an older female with graying muzzle, began to do something extraordinary. She started marking certain trees with claw marks, but these weren't random territorial markings. They were deliberate, precise, creating patterns that matched the spirals on the ground. Other bears watched and then began to help, each adding their own marks, creating a 3-dimensional map of the wind's path through the forest. It was documentation, pure and simple, a way of recording what had happened for future generations. The mother bear's cub watched everything with intense focus, occasionally attempting its own small marks on lower bark, practicing the art of forest documentation that it would one day master. The education happening here was so complex, so multi-layered, that Ethan realized human understanding of animal intelligence had been fundamentally flawed. These creatures weren't just responding to instinct or even learned behavior. They were thinking, planning, recording, teaching in ways that suggested consciousness every bit as complex as human awareness, just expressed differently. As the night progressed, more animals joined the gathering. Foxes, raccoons, even a family of skunks, all drawn by the glowing patterns and the sense that something important was being shared. They maintained respectful distances from each other, natural enmities temporarily suspended in favor of this larger purpose. Each species seemed to contribute something unique to the understanding of what had occurred. The birds shared information about how the winds had looked from above. The burrowing animals reported on changes underground. The deer described alterations in the magnetic fields they used for navigation. The mother bear's shelter had become the center of what Ethan could only describe as a forest university, a place where knowledge was shared across species boundaries in ways that human science said was impossible. Yet here it was, happening right before his eyes, documented by multiple cameras, witnessed by 2 trained observers. The implications were staggering, not just for biology and ecology, but for humanity's entire understanding of consciousness and communication in the natural world. Near dawn, as the gathering began to disperse, each animal returning to its own territory, the mother bear did one final thing that left Ethan speechless. She went to her shelter and emerged with something in her mouth, a piece of bark that she had been keeping inside. She placed it carefully at the entrance, and in the growing morning light, Ethan could see that it had markings on it, deliberate scratches that formed patterns. She had been creating her own record of events inside the shelter, documenting her construction process, the winds, the healing of the injured bear, all recorded in a script that humans couldn't read, but that clearly meant something to her and the other animals who paused to examine it before leaving. The sun rose on a forest that had been fundamentally transformed, not just physically, but in terms of the relationships between its inhabitants. The spiral patterns remained on the ground, now permanent features that would influence movement patterns for generations. The shelter stood as a monument to animal intelligence and foresight, a structure that had proven its worth not once but twice, serving multiple purposes that its creator had somehow anticipated. And the mother bear continued her patient teaching, showing her cub not just how to survive, but how to be part of something larger, how to read the forest's messages and contribute to its collective wisdom. Days passed, and Ethan and Lily continued their observations, documenting changes that occurred in waves. Plants grew in new patterns, following the spirals. Animals developed new behaviors, cooperating in ways that had never been recorded before. The bear's shelter became a regular gathering place, sometimes for healing, sometimes for shelter during normal storms, sometimes just for the sharing of information. The mother bear maintained it carefully, making small improvements, always teaching her cub through example. The young male bear who had been healed returned often, and Ethan realized he had become something like an apprentice to the mother bear. She taught him construction techniques, showed him which plants had healing properties, demonstrated how to read the subtle signs that preceded the winds. He was learning not just survival skills, but the deeper knowledge that would allow him to build his own shelter someday, to contribute to the forest's collective wisdom, to teach others what he had learned. Other bears began construction projects of their own, not copies of the mother bear's shelter, but variations, each adapted to different locations and needs. Some built near water sources, incorporating drainage systems that the mother bear hadn't needed. Others built in rocky areas, using natural cave formations as starting points. But all showed the same careful planning, the same integration with the spiral patterns that now seemed to be the forest's fundamental organizing principle. It was like watching the birth of architecture in a species that wasn't supposed to be capable of it. The cub grew rapidly, both physically and in terms of knowledge. It could now predict weather changes hours in advance, knew which plants to gather for different ailments, understood the complex social dynamics that governed the forest community. But most remarkably, it had begun to innovate, to try new construction techniques, to experiment with different materials. The mother bear encouraged this creativity, allowing the cub to make mistakes and learn from them, understanding that innovation was as important as tradition in the continuation of knowledge. One morning, about 2 weeks after the second wind event, something new happened. The cub discovered that certain stones, when arranged in specific patterns, seemed to amplify the phosphorescent glow that still occasionally emerged from the ground. It spent hours experimenting, moving stones around, creating different configurations, until it had built what could only be described as a primitive beacon, a structure that collected and focused the forest's energy into a visible signal. The mother bear watched with what looked like pride, occasionally offering guidance but mostly letting her cub explore this discovery independently. Other animals noticed the cub's innovation and began their own experiments. Crows brought shiny objects to add to the stone arrangements. Squirrels contributed specific types of nuts that, when placed in certain positions, seemed to affect the glow's color. Even insects participated, with fireflies synchronizing their flashing with the beacon's pulse, creating a living light show that could be seen from great distances. It was collaborative innovation, cross-species engineering that suggested the forest was developing its own technology, organic and integrated with natural systems but undeniably purposeful and designed. Lily had been analyzing all the data they had collected, and her conclusions were revolutionary. The forest wasn't just a collection of individual organisms competing for resources. It was a superorganism, a conscious entity made up of countless smaller consciousnesses, all connected through mechanisms that science was only beginning to glimpse. The winds weren't random weather events but part of the forest's respiratory system, redistributing resources, energy, and information. The bear's shelter and others like it weren't just animal architecture but organs in this larger body, serving functions that benefited the entire system. The mother bear seemed to understand this intuitively, her actions always considering not just her own survival, but the forest's health as a whole. She had become something like a forest engineer, maintaining critical infrastructure that other species depended on. Her shelter had saved not just her own cub, but had provided healing for injured animals, refuge during storms, and a gathering place for the sharing of vital information. She had built not just a structure but an institution, a permanent addition to the forest's social architecture. As autumn approached, the forest began to prepare for winter, but the preparations were different from previous years. The animals worked together more coordinated, sharing information about food sources, collaborating on shelter improvements, even creating communal food storage areas that multiple species could access. The spiral patterns on the ground had become highways of cooperation, paths along which resources and information flowed freely. The mother bear's innovation had triggered a transformation that was reshaping the entire ecosystem. The cub was now large enough to help with serious construction work, and together with its mother they began to expand the shelter system. They weren't just making it bigger, but more complex, adding features that seemed designed for specific purposes. A chamber with particular ventilation that would maintain constant temperature, perfect for storing medicinal plants. A section with acoustic properties that amplified sound, useful for communication during storms. Even what appeared to be a primitive calendar system, marks on the walls that tracked lunar cycles and seasonal changes. One day, a human family hiked through the area, completely unaware of the marvel they were passing. They walked right over the spiral patterns without noticing them, passed within feet of the bear's shelter without recognizing it as anything more than a natural formation. Ethan watched them go, realizing how blind most humans were to the intelligence that surrounded them, how much they missed by assuming they were the only conscious architects on the planet. The forest kept its secrets from those who weren't ready to see them, revealing its wonders only to those who approached with patience and respect. The mother bear watched the humans pass with calm indifference, neither threatened nor particularly interested. She had more important work to do. Winter was coming, and with it would come new challenges that required new solutions. She had begun working on something that looked like an insulation system, weaving together materials in ways that would trap air and maintain warmth. Her cub helped, learning not just the how but the why, understanding the principles behind the construction rather than just mimicking the actions. As the days grew shorter and colder, more animals began to visit the shelter, not seeking refuge but studying its design. Some were preparing for hibernation and wanted to understand the ventilation system. Others were year-round residents who needed to improve their own shelters for the harsh months ahead. The mother bear taught them all, demonstrating techniques, allowing them to examine her work closely, even helping some with their own construction projects. She had become a master builder whose knowledge was sought by the entire forest community. The first snow of winter arrived early, but the forest was ready. The shelter systems that had been built following the mother bear's example all functioned perfectly, maintaining warmth and air circulation even as snow piled up outside. The spiral patterns on the ground remained visible even under the snow, glowing faintly with that phosphorescent light, creating a map that helped animals navigate even in whiteout conditions. The forest had been transformed into a resilient community that could face whatever challenges nature presented. Inside her shelter, the mother bear and her cub settled in for a long winter's rest, but not hibernation in the traditional sense. They would sleep deeply but wake periodically to maintain the shelter, to check on cached food supplies, to observe and learn from winter's different rhythms. The cub had grown tremendously, not just in size, but in wisdom, carrying forward knowledge that would reshape how future generations of bears lived in these forests. The shelter around them wasn't just walls and chambers anymore, but a testament to the power of intelligence applied to survival, of innovation passed from parent to child, of knowledge shared across species boundaries. As Ethan and Lily packed up their equipment to leave before winter made the roads impassable, they took one last look at the site that had changed their understanding of the world. The mother bear's shelter was now covered with snow, invisible to casual observation, but they knew it was there. Knew that inside, a remarkable creature was passing on knowledge that stretched back generations and would extend forward to futures they could barely imagine. The forest had revealed one of its great secrets to them, showing them that intelligence and consciousness weren't unique to humans but were woven throughout the natural world in forms that humanity was only beginning to recognize. The story they would tell the scientific community would be met with skepticism, even with their extensive documentation. But they had seen the truth with their own eyes, had witnessed the forest's intelligence manifesting through its creatures, had documented proof that animals were capable of architecture, engineering, medicine, and teaching in ways that demanded a complete reimagining of humanity's place in the world. The mother bear had built more than a shelter. She had built a bridge between worlds, showing that the gap between human and animal intelligence was far smaller than anyone had imagined, that consciousness took many forms, all deserving of respect and wonder. As they drove away, the forest settled into winter's quiet rhythm. But beneath the snow, in shelters and burrows and dens, the work continued. Animals refined their constructions, experimented with new techniques, passed on knowledge to their young. The spiral patterns pulsed with faint light, maintaining connections even in the cold. And in her remarkable shelter, the mother bear dozed peacefully, her cub pressed against her warm fur, both of them dreaming perhaps of spring, when they would emerge to continue their work as architects of the forest, builders of bridges between species, teachers of ancient wisdom that was simultaneously older than human civilization and constantly being renewed through innovation and experiment. The wind would come again in its season, and when it did, the forest would be ready. Not just to survive, but to thrive, to use the wind's power for renewal and growth, to continue evolving the complex civilization that existed parallel to but hidden from human society. The mother bear had shown the way, had demonstrated that survival wasn't just about strength or instinct, but about intelligence, cooperation, and the patient accumulation of knowledge across generations. Her shelter stood as proof that animals were capable of everything humans were. They just expressed it differently, in ways that required careful observation and open minds to perceive. Months later, when Ethan's footage was finally released to the public, it created a sensation that rippled far beyond the scientific community. People around the world watched in amazement as the bear built her complex shelter, as the winds danced through the forest in impossible patterns, as animals cooperated in ways that challenged every assumption about consciousness and intelligence. But for every person who saw it as proof of animal consciousness, there were others who dismissed it as coincidence, instinct, or misinterpretation. The debate raged in academic journals and social media alike, but the forest didn't care about human debates. It continued its ancient dance, its creatures building and teaching and learning, advancing their own civilization in ways that most humans would never see or understand. The mother bear's cub grew to adulthood and eventually built its own shelter, even more complex than its mother's, incorporating innovations learned from other species and its own experiments. It taught its own cubs in turn, passing on not just construction techniques, but the deeper understanding that they were part of something larger, part of a forest consciousness that transcended individual lives. The spiral patterns remained on the ground, renewed by each generation, serving as both map and memory, guiding animals through space and time, connecting them to their ancestors and descendants in an unbroken chain of wisdom. Years passed, and the forest grew around and through the structures the animals had built, incorporating them into its body, making them indistinguishable from natural formations to untrained eyes. But they were there, a hidden architecture that supported the forest's life, channels through which energy and information flowed. Nodes in a network of consciousness that spanned continents and connected forests in ways that human science was only beginning to suspect. The mother bear's innovation had spread far beyond her own forest, carried by migrating animals, by winds that bore seeds and spores, by mechanisms that transcended physical distance. And in forests around the world, other animals were building, innovating, teaching, creating their own architectural traditions adapted to local conditions and needs. Elephants in Africa were constructing water management systems that would be attributed to ancient human civilizations. Dolphins in the ocean were creating underwater structures that served purposes humans couldn't fathom. Birds were building nests that were actually components in larger communication networks. The revolution in understanding that had begun with one bear's shelter was spreading, revealing that the entire planet was home to countless non-human civilizations, all developing, all conscious, all deserving of recognition and respect. The implications for humanity were profound. If animals were conscious architects capable of innovation and teaching, what did that mean for how humans treated them, how they used their habitats, how they thought about their own place in the world? Some people embraced the new understanding, working to protect and learn from animal civilizations. Others rejected it, clinging to the comfortable belief that humans were uniquely intelligent, uniquely conscious, uniquely important. But the evidence continued to mount, documented by researchers around the world who had learned to look more carefully, to observe with patience and humility, to recognize intelligence in forms they had never imagined. Back in the original forest, the mother bear had grown old, her muzzle gray, her movements slower but still purposeful. She spent her days maintaining her shelter and teaching, always teaching. Young bears came from territories far away to learn from her, to understand not just how to build but why, to grasp the principles that would allow them to innovate rather than just copy. She had become a living library, a repository of knowledge that spanned generations, a bridge between the ancient wisdom of the forest and its constantly evolving future. Her original cub, now a massive adult with cubs of its own, had taken over much of the teaching, but still came to her for advice on particularly challenging problems. Together, they were working on something new, a structure that seemed designed to harness the phosphorescent energy that flowed through the forest, to store it somehow for use during the dark winter months. It was ambitious, perhaps impossible, but they worked with patience and determination, knowing that even if they didn't complete it, the knowledge gained from the attempt would be valuable for future generations. The forest itself seemed to be evolving in response to the architectural innovations of its inhabitants. Trees grew in patterns that complemented the animal structures, their roots interweaving with underground tunnels to create hybrid systems that were part plant, part animal construction. Fungi networked through it all, carrying chemical signals that coordinated growth and development across vast distances. The boundary between natural and constructed had become meaningless. Everything was both. Everything was part of the forest's living architecture. Scientists like Ethan and Lily continued to study and document, but they had learned that observation alone wasn't enough. To truly understand what was happening, they had to become part of it, to contribute their own knowledge to the forest's collective wisdom while learning from it in return. They built their own structures following principles learned from the animals, created their own patterns that integrated with the spirals on the ground, added their own voices to the forest's ancient conversation. It was a new kind of science, participatory rather than observational, recognizing that consciousness wasn't something to be studied from outside, but something to be engaged with as equals. The shelter that had started it all still stood, weathered but solid, a monument to one bear's vision and determination. Animals still visited it, still learned from it, still added to it. It had become more than architecture, more than engineering. It was art, philosophy, a physical manifestation of the forest's collective intelligence. Every beam and stone, every tunnel and chamber told a story of survival and innovation, of knowledge passed between species and generations, of consciousness recognizing itself in countless forms and celebrating that recognition through collaborative creation. And somewhere in the forest, as sunset painted the sky in shades of gold and violet, a young bear cub watched its mother work, learning lessons that went far beyond simple survival. It was learning that it was part of something magnificent, something that stretched back to the beginning of life and forward to futures unimaginable. It was learning that intelligence took many forms, that wisdom could be found in unexpected places, that the world was full of teachers if one knew how to listen. Most importantly, it was learning that it too had something to contribute, that its own innovations and insights would one day be added to the forest's vast store of knowledge, helping to build a future where all conscious beings recognized and respected each other's intelligence. The wind began to sing again in the highest branches, that low hum that preceded the spiral winds. But now it wasn't a warning of something to be survived, but an announcement of something to be celebrated. The forest was ready, its inhabitants prepared. Their shelters and structures integrated into a system that could not just withstand the wind, but use it, learn from it, grow stronger because of it. The mother bear, old now but still strong, stood at the entrance to her shelter and listened to the wind's song, understanding its message in ways that human language could never express. As darkness fell and stars emerged overhead, the phosphorescent glow began to emerge from the ground, following the spiral patterns, connecting all the structures and shelters in a web of light that pulsed with life. It was beautiful beyond description, a visualization of the forest's consciousness, proof that intelligence and awareness weren't limited to human brains, but were properties of life itself, manifesting in countless ways, building countless structures, telling countless stories, all part of the same great narrative of existence exploring and understanding itself. The mother bear's legacy would live on long after she was gone, not just in the shelter she had built, but in the revolution of understanding she had started. Future generations of all species would live in a world where the intelligence of animals was recognized and respected, where the structures they built were studied and learned from, where the wisdom of the forest was integrated with human knowledge to create something greater than either could achieve alone. The spiral patterns would continue to spread. The architectural innovations would continue to evolve. The forest's consciousness would continue to grow and develop in ways that no single species could predict or control. But for now, in this moment, there was peace. The mother bear settled into her shelter with her descendants around her. The forest glowed with gentle light. The wind sang its ancient songs, and all was well. The world was full of consciousness, full of intelligence, full of builders and teachers and learners, all contributing to the great work of existence, understanding itself. The shelter stood as proof that miracles were real, that animals were capable of wonders, that the world was far more magical and mysterious than most humans ever imagined. And in that magic, in that mystery, was hope for a future where all conscious beings could thrive together, building structures not just of stone and wood, but of understanding and respect, creating a world that honored the intelligence of all its inhabitants.